He belted out his final chorus, only to have the music die and the mic ripped away, until live drums and guitar roared him back into glory. 82 years had carved deep lines into Arthur's face, each one a testament to a life lived less in comfort and more in service. Yet tonight, under the garish glow of the neon cactus karaoke bar, a different kind of etching began. His shoulders, still broad, despite the stoop of age, moved with a surprising grace as he navigated the narrow path to the stage, the scent of stale beer and cheap perfume clinging to the air like a second skin. The flickering LED sign above the stage, promising tonight's stars, seemed to mock him, a cruel joke for a man who had long ago ceased to crave any spotlight. His fingers, gnarled with arthritis, brushed the cold, slick metal of the microphone stand, a shiver running up his arm that had nothing to do with the bar's overzealous air conditioning. The murmuring crowd, a hazy blur of faces bathed in the shifting hues of the stage lights, seemed to hold its breath, a collective pause before the inevitable. This isn't about them, he reminded himself, his jaw tightening. This is for me, just this one song. His choice, a classic country ballad, was a quiet rebellion against the youthful exuberance that usually dominated the neon cactus stage. He cleared his throat, the sound a low rumble, and the first notes of the backing track swelled, a familiar melody that brought a flicker of light to his weary eyes. His voice, surprisingly strong for his age, resonated through the speakers, slightly gravelly but full of an undeniable sincerity. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him, transporting him back to dusty desert outposts and the camaraderie of brothers in arms. Each word was a memory, a silent tribute to fallen comrades and sacrifices rarely acknowledged. The raw emotion in his voice, unpolished but genuine, cut through the usual cacophony of the bar, drawing a few curious glances, then more. He swayed slightly, lost in the song's narrative, his hand gripping the microphone with a white-knuckled intensity. The bar, which had been buzzing with desultory chatter, began to quiet, the clinking of glasses and the sporadic bursts of laughter gradually receding. A few patrons, initially scoffing, found themselves drawn in by the sheer, unexpected depth of his performance. They don't understand what this means, he thought, a fragile warmth spreading through his chest. They just hear a song. I hear a lifetime. The bass drum throbbed a steady rhythm, mirroring the beat of his own heart, a steady, unwavering pulse that had carried him through so many battles, so many years. The neon lights seemed to soften, their harsh edges blurring as a strange intimacy settled over the room. His voice soared on the chorus, a mournful lament of loss and resilience, and for a fleeting moment, he felt utterly free. The years melted away, the aches in his joints forgotten, replaced by the familiar rush of adrenaline that came from facing down a challenge, even one as seemingly innocuous as a karaoke performance. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, not with the usual detached amusement, but with a nascent respect, a flicker of understanding. A waitress paused mid-stride, her tray laden with empty glasses forgotten as she listened. The barman, usually oblivious, leaned against the counter, his towel draped over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the small stage. The air itself seemed to thicken, heavy with the unspoken stories that his song evoked. Before we continue with the story, be sure to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments. We love learning about our viewers. Now let's get back to the story. Then came the interruption. Sharp and jarring, a cold splash of reality. A young man, barely out of his teens, with a sneer etched onto his face, pushed past the crowd, his eyes blazing with a manufactured indignation. He was the resident DJ, a self-proclaimed arbiter of the night's entertainment, and clearly, Arthur's performance was not to his liking. A palpable wave of unease rippled through the bar, the fragile spell broken. Arthur's eyes, which had been closed in concentration, snapped open, the harsh reality of the flashing lights assaulting them. He saw the DJ's outstretched hand, a predatory claw reaching for the microphone, and a knot of dread began to form in his stomach. Not now, not like this. The DJ's voice, amplified and distorted by the very system Arthur was using, ripped through the air, crude and dismissive. "All right, Grandpa, That's enough of your lullabies. We got real music to play tonight." The words, laced with contempt, were a physical blow, stripping away the dignity Arthur had meticulously rebuilt with each sung note. The microphone, still warm from his touch, was wrenched from his grasp with a vicious tug, a harsh crackle of static accompanying its departure. The backing track, mid-sentence, died with an abrupt, sickening squelch, leaving a void that echoed with the sudden, embarrassing silence. "I once carried my platoon through gunfire. Now I can't even finish this song." The humiliation burned, a raw, angry fire. He stood frozen, his hands still outstretched, grasping at empty air where the microphone had been. The abrupt cessation of the music left a ringing in his ears, a mocking testament to the abruptness of his dismissal. The few sympathetic glances from moments before had shifted to a mixture of pity and discomfort, a quick turning away. A few snickers rippled through the younger crowd, emboldened by the DJ's callousness. The fluorescent lights above the stage, which had seemed to dim in deference to his song, now blazed with a harsh, unforgiving glare, illuminating every tremble in his aged hands, every slump in his shoulders. The cold sweat that had gathered on his brow now felt like icy needles, stinging his skin. He wanted nothing more than to disappear, to simply melt into the sticky floor. The DJ, satisfied with his display of dominance, turned his back, already fumbling with his laptop, preparing to blast some insipid pop anthem. The audience, momentarily stunned, began to murmur again, the brief silence shattered by a fresh wave of chatter, louder this time, more dismissive. Arthur felt a familiar constriction in his chest, the weight of a lifetime of unspoken burdens pressing down on him. His throat felt raw, not from singing, but from the unshed tears of indignant shame. He looked down at his empty hands, hands that had once held rifles, steered ships, and saluted flags, now rendered useless, discarded. The air crackled with the residual energy of the music that had been so cruelly cut short. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself, to regain some semblance of composure. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, metallic and acrid. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave, to escape this public mortification. But decades of discipline, of pushing through adversity, held him rooted to the spot. He wouldn't bolt. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. His gaze, though clouded with pain, was still defiant. He slowly lowered his arm, his fingers curling into a tight fist, the last vestiges of his performance bleeding out into the sterile air of the neon cactus. The very essence of his quiet pride was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. The screen above the stage, which had displayed the lyrics, now flickered, the words of his unfinished song hanging there for a split second before dissolving into a pixelated jumble, then cutting to black as his voice died. The black screen was a cruel mirror, reflecting back his stunned face, a mask of disbelief and raw hurt. 100 tiny cameras, disguised as cell phones, glinted in the dim light, capturing every nuance of his public humiliation, their red recording indicators winking like malevolent eyes. The collective gasp that had followed the abrupt silencing of the microphone had been quickly replaced by a ripple of hushed whispers, then a few nervous titters that blossomed into outright laughter from the back of the bar, fueled by cheap beer and a lack of empathy. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face, leaving a cold hollowness in his veins. Each click of a camera shutter was a fresh assault, every whispered joke a barb piercing his already wounded pride. They're all watching. They're all laughing. His fingers, still curled from gripping the absent microphone, began to tremble uncontrollably, a tremor that spread through his entire frame. He could feel the sticky residue of spilled beer beneath his worn combat boots, a grim reminder of the bar's chaotic reality, so far removed from the quiet dignity of his service. The smell of stale smoke and stale dreams hung heavy in the air, a suffocating shroud. He wanted to speak, to lash out, to demand an explanation for this callous disregard, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the burning lump of shame. His lips parted, a dry, cracking sound escaping, but nothing intelligible followed. He was a statue carved from indignity, frozen in the harsh glare of the stage lights. The DJ, oblivious or uncaring, had already moved on, his fingers dancing across the mixing board, preparing for the next, more appropriate song. The bass began to throb, a low, insistent pulse that rattled the floorboards, a stark contrast to the gentle melody that had been so brutally interrupted. The crowd, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began to relax, their attention already drifting away from the old man on stage. He was yesterday's news, a fleeting moment of awkwardness quickly forgotten in the relentless churn of the neon cactus's nightly entertainment. This is it then, he thought, a wave of profound despair washing over him. This is how it ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper, in a karaoke bar. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a desperate attempt to block out the harsh reality, to find a sliver of the quiet dignity he had sought on that stage. When he opened them, he saw the blurry reflection of his own weary face in the darkened screen, etched with lines of age and fresh humiliation. His military career, spanning decades of unwavering loyalty and untold sacrifices, seemed to mock him from the distant past. He had faced down hostile fire, endured unimaginable hardships, and yet, a young man with a microphone had managed to cut him deeper than any enemy bullet ever could. The sheer absurdity of it all, the profound injustice, made his stomach clench. A single tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down his weathered cheek, a rogue soldier escaping the battle within. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his hand, a gesture born of ingrained stoicism. Veterans didn't cry. Not in public. Not ever. But the pain was raw, unvarnished, gnawing at the edges of his carefully constructed composure. The laughter from the back of the bar seemed to swell, a mocking chorus that underscored his isolation. He felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of indifferent faces, his uniform, folded neatly in his closet at home, feeling like a million miles away, a distant relic of a life that no longer mattered. His knees felt weak, threatening to buckle beneath him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady the frantic beat of his heart. He had to move. He couldn't stand there, a spectacle for the amusement of strangers. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and walk away, to escape the searing spotlight of shame. But his feet felt rooted to the spot, heavy as lead. The bar, once a blur of welcoming lights, now felt like a predatory beast, its neon glow a hungry maw, ready to consume him whole. The air conditioning, which had seemed so aggressive earlier, now felt like a cold embrace, tightening around his chest, making it difficult to breathe. The taste of salt was on his tongue, from the tear, from the regret. Just as he was about to make the agonizing decision to turn and walk away, to surrender to the overwhelming wave of humiliation, a figure emerged from the shadowy recesses near the bar, a silent sentinel against the tide of mockery. It was the owner, a man Arthur had only seen in passing, a man whose presence usually blended into the background of the chaotic night. He was a burly individual, with a perpetually worried frown etched between his eyes, but tonight his jaw was set, his movements deliberate, imbued with a quiet authority that cut through the lingering buzz of the room. A strange hush began to fall over the bar, a ripple of surprised recognition. The owner's gaze swept across the scene, taking in the cowering veteran, the smug DJ, and the curious, now silent, crowd. His eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to absorb every detail, every flicker of emotion. Arthur felt a spark of something, not hope, not yet, but a faint stirring of curiosity, a momentary reprieve from the relentless assault of shame. The owner's silhouette, framed by the pulsating club lights, seemed to grow larger, more imposing, as he strode purposefully towards the stage. Each step was measured, deliberate, and with every footfall, the lingering laughter seemed to fade, replaced by a growing anticipation, a sense of something momentous about to unfold. Without a word, the owner reached the stage, his gaze still fixed on the DJ. The DJ, caught off guard by the owner's sudden appearance, offered a nervous, forced smile, attempting to brush off the interruption. But the owner's expression was unyielding, his silence more potent than any shouted reprimand. He reached out, not for the microphone, but for the power strip behind the DJ booth. His movements precise and unflinching. A collective intake of breath rippled through the now completely silent bar as he grasped the main power plug, his hand hovering for a tense, agonizing second. Arthur watched, mesmerized, a fragile tendril of hope beginning to unfurl in his chest. The owner's hand descended, firm and decisive, on the plug. A sharp, almost theatrical crackle accompanied the separation of the prongs from their socket, and then, with a definitive thunk, the speakers died, the pulsating bass track abruptly cut off, plunging the neon cactus into an eerie, profound silence, pausing the mockery. The absolute silence that followed the sudden death of the speakers was a physical entity, pressing down on the bar, smothering every lingering murmur, every last snicker. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had only moments before filled the space. The owner stood there, a silent, imposing figure, his hand still on the unplugged cord, his gaze locked on the stunned DJ, who now looked less smug and more like a deer caught in headlights. Arthur, his breath still caught in his throat, felt a strange lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The cold grip of shame began to recede, replaced by a tentative, almost fragile sense of wonder. What just happened? The owner finally shifted his gaze, his dark eyes finding Arthur's, a silent communication passing between them that transcended words. There was no pity in the owner's eyes, no condescension, only a profound, almost primal understanding, a shared acknowledgement of a line that had been crossed. He then turned to face the hushed crowd, his expression unreadable. His voice, when it came, was a low murmur, barely audible above the ringing in Arthur's ears, yet it carried an undeniable authority, a quiet force that compelled attention. "Not on my watch," he said, his voice flat, resolute, sending a shiver down Arthur's spine that was not from cold. It was a statement, not a question, a decree that instantly recalibrated the atmosphere of the neon cactus. He then gestured with a subtle nod of his head towards the far corner of the bar, where a small, unassuming house band was usually relegated to background music. Their instruments, a battered drum kit, a few guitars, and a bass, stood silent, gathering dust. The band members, who had been witnessing the entire spectacle with a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury, now straightened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. The owner's eyes, still holding Arthur's, softened infinitesimally, a silent directive, a promise of redemption. He's not just stopping it, he's fixing it. The thought, fragile as spun glass, bloomed in Arthur's chest, a tiny seed of hope pushing through barren ground. The owner, with a final, unblinking stare at the now thoroughly chastised DJ, then turned back to Arthur, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. He picked up the microphone from where the DJ had dropped it, carefully, almost reverently, checking the cord for damage. He then walked over to Arthur, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet, and gently placed the microphone back in Arthur's trembling hand, the cold metal feeling strangely warm against his skin this time. The gesture was a silent apology, a profound act of respect that spoke volumes. The weight of the microphone, so light in his hand, felt like the heaviest burden and the greatest gift all at once. "Finish your song, Art," the owner murmured, his voice barely a whisper, meant only for Arthur's ears. "And this time, you've got a band to back you up." He then nodded towards the band members, a decisive gesture that left no room for argument. The veteran's eyes, still clouded with residual shock, widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the microphone in his hand, then at the owner, then at the band, a slow dawning of comprehension blooming in his mind. The impossible was happening. The humiliation was being wiped clean, replaced by something far more profound, far more unexpected. "He's giving me back my voice. He's giving me back my honor." The band members, galvanized by the owner's directive, began to stir, a flurry of quiet, efficient movements. The drummer, a grizzled man with kind eyes, picked up his sticks, testing their weight. The lead guitarist, a young woman with a fierce gaze, adjusted her strap. The bassist, a stoic man with a long beard, tuned his instrument with quiet precision. A nervous energy began to ripple through the bar again, but this time it was laced with anticipation, not mockery. The cell phones, which had been recording his shame, were now held aloft, not for laughter, but for witness, for the unexpected unfolding of grace. The drummer's sticks clicked together twice, a sharp, resonant sound that cut through the silence. Then, a low, throbbing bass line began, hesitant at first, then, gaining confidence, weaving a rich tapestry of sound. The guitarist joined in, her fingers dancing across the fretboard, coaxing a mournful, yet powerful melody from her instrument. The harmony swelled, a warm, enveloping blanket of sound that surrounded Arthur, lifting him, supporting him. It was the same song, his song, but now it was imbued with a new life, a new power, a raw, organic energy that the pre-recorded track could never have matched. The air vibrated with the nascent power of live music. Arthur's voice, initially shaky, found its footing, buoyed by the surging tide of the live instruments. He began to sing again, from the point where he had been so cruelly cut off, his voice stronger now, imbued with a newfound conviction, a raw, untamed passion. Every word was a defiant roar against injustice, a testament to resilience, a hymn of redemption. The bar patrons, who had been silently watching, began to lean forward, captivated. Some even put down their phones, lost in the raw, unadulterated emotion that poured from the stage. The music was not just background noise, it was a living, breathing entity, a force that demanded attention. The band, attuned to every nuance of his voice, followed him, anticipating his every pause, every swell of emotion. The guitarist launched into a searing, soulful solo, her notes bending and twisting, echoing the pain and triumph in Arthur's voice. The drums thundered, a powerful, rhythmic heartbeat, propelling the song forward, carrying Arthur on its crest. He closed his eyes again, but this time, it was not in pain, but in pure, unadulterated joy, letting the music wash over him, immersing him in its raw power. The air was electric, charged with emotion, every note a brushstroke painting a masterpiece of vindication. He belted out the final chorus, his voice hoarse but triumphant, amplified by the thunderous roar of the live band. The last chord hung in the air, a long, sustained note that vibrated through every bone in Arthur's body, silencing every critic, every doubt. The last reverberations faded, leaving only the sound of his ragged breath and the stunned silence of the room. The first snare, hit echoing through stunned silence,